Okay, welcome everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to our Lunch and Learn about how video assessments are helping the community understand Duchenne progression. This afternoon we have with us Mindy Leffler, Christine McSherry, and Linda Lowe's. I've known these three women for many, many years. Mindy has a son, Aiden, and is mom of Aiden. Christine is a mom of Jet, and Linda Lowe's is an expert in physical therapy and cares for so many families at Nationwide Children's Hospital. We have known each other for so many years and talked about the difficulty of participation in clinical trials. We've talked about the burden of participation. We've talked about how clinical trials are exclusive to often a very narrow population of people. We've also talked about outcome measures and how that one-time outcome measure at a given institution might not be representative of the child at home. So in all of these discussions, we've agreed that parents are the ones who know. They can see what progression looks like, they can identify changes in how their children move and what's going to happen next. So we've, in these discussions, thought about that, and I have to say that Christine and Mindy, thinking about this in detail, started a company called Casimir. And this is to look at video assessments that are done at home by parents. This lessens the burden, expands the opportunity to participate, and enables the experts, the parents, to understand and help and become leading experts in changing this paradigm and getting approvals. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mindy Leffler to start in.
Great. Pat, thank you so much. And thank you so much for the opportunity to talk to the community. We're excited about where we're at. We're really thankful for the guidance that we've gotten from the experts that have participated and really thankful also for the participation from the community. So we're excited to be able to do this. Just as a quick introduction, so I'm Mindy Leffler, and I have, as of last week, a 17-year-old with muscular dystrophy who's been in a number of clinical trials. And before I send it over to Christine and Linda, I just want to acknowledge that I'm sure that there are a number of different audiences on the webinar, but we want to speak directly to families in the community and to really tell the story of how this project evolved, because it is kind of all of our stories. So we're really going to speak directly to you. So if anybody has additional questions afterwards, please get in touch and let us know.
Hi, I'm Christine McSherry. I co-founded Casimir with Mindy. I have a 24-year-old son named Jet. He was in the Exondys 51 eteplirsen study, and that's where Mindy and I began to notice some different types of changes in our kids. Jet is a very independent young man, and we're really thankful to the community for their part in helping us build what we built so far. So without all the videos that you sent in, and without answering all the Facebook posts and the messages, we wouldn't be where we are here today. But you really helped us along, so thank you. And of course, thank you to the KOLs and the PTs in the space, including Linda, for all of their participation. And PPMD and Pat and Ryan's guidance has been really great. So thank you, everybody. And I will let Linda introduce herself.
Hello, I'm Linda Lowe's. I work at Nationwide Children's Hospital here in Columbus. I do a lot of the clinical evaluations for all those trials, so I get to spend time with your sons, and I also do outcome measures research. So got invited to help on this project by Mindy a couple of years ago, and happy to be part of it.
Great. So we're going to start out with some basics from Linda that I think will be helpful for everybody.
So when we wanted to talk a little bit about outcome measures, and I know you all take your children to clinic or you take them to trials, and so you know that we measure a lot of things. There's kind of a hierarchy in outcome measures. So you'd start with the impairment level, and those are things like strength and range of motion. And we know that those are important, but they're not really important in and of themselves. If you lose strength, that's unfortunate, but it doesn't impact you until it makes a difference in your walking or not being able to climb stairs or to get dressed. So that's function, and that's typically what we've moved to in most clinical trials, is measuring function. How can your sons do their daily activities? What we're finding, though, and we'll talk a little bit about that more, is that what is even more important than that is participation. And that's how do you do these functions in your real life? So not in my clinic, but at home and school and with your friends. So the video assessments are shifting more to that participation level of outcome, which we think will have a lot more meaning to the families and the kids. Quality of life is everyone's ultimate goal, is to impact your son's quality of life. I think that the difficulty with that one is there's so many things that play a role in your quality of life other than your strength. And so we think that the participation level is a great target to get something meaningful that we can measure. So Christine alluded to the fact that outcome measures, not one size does not fit all. We all love this cartoon. And I think that's what sometimes limits the people who can participate in clinical trials, is because for a traditional study, you need to pick something. And so you can't measure everyone's individual abilities and difficulties. So we'll go on to the next one. So the traditional outcome measures have served us well. We've learned a lot from them. And some of the things that are good about them is that we've spent a lot of time, experts in the field have designed these. They've spent a lot of time deciding what is meaningful, what's changed. They've worked on the psychometric properties of testing, so they know if they're reliable and valid. They're standardized, and they have a natural history. So we can tell you, if you change 3 points on a certain scale, how does that compare to people in the past? And it's also used in standard clinical care, which also gives another frame of reference. Some of the things that we are trying to overcome is that these tests do require expert administration. That means you have to fly to Columbus, Ohio, or someplace else where someone like me lives. And Columbus has its, up points, but I don't think that's where you want to spend your family vacation. It's also an artificial environment. They come into my clinic, and depending on how we get along, that's how well they perform. They get one shot. They come on their Tuesday, and if they fall on the way into clinic, or their plane was delayed and they don't get any sleep, it may or may not be the boy's best performance. And because you have to have a specific outcome, it really is a narrow inclusion criteria. So these are some of the things that we think could be improved by a home-based assessment.
And just to add to that, from the family's perspective, when Christine and I got started, digging into this issue and really thinking through our own experience in clinical trial participation, we started hearing some of the same themes from families. And really a huge one is this idea of travel fatigue, and the fact that it's not equivalent to have a kid that's driving 20 minutes to get to clinic from a kid that has to fly 4 hours. And I mean, I don't know if it's something vasodilative or circulatory or what about putting a boy with Duchenne on an airplane, but a lot of parents will talk about some decrease in strength once the kids get off a plane. And I'm exhausted at the end of the day, spending an entire day in clinic. So I can only imagine what the boys feel like. So I think that plays a role as well. I don't know if other parents beyond the ones that we've spoken to have noticed this, but whenever my son goes fight or flight, his calves get really firm, and he has a harder time functioning. One time he did a graduation speech for 8th grade graduation, and even though he was fully ambulatory at the time, he had a really hard time walking afterwards, and it was because he'd gone so fight or flight and gotten really nervous about his speech. And so you can imagine that if a kid has a lot of fear about an upcoming blood draw, or has just gone through a really traumatic blood draw, that might have an effect on his performance as well. And obviously any condition where there's cognitive implications from the kids, being taken away from the parents and going with unfamiliar people can make a difference. And the relationship of, all of our kids to the coordinators that they're working with makes a huge difference. And then lastly, Lynn and I were talking about this years ago and trying to figure out why we were hearing some stories from physical therapists about variability from day to day in trials that had 2-day assessments. And we weren't really hearing that from the families at home, that extent of variability from day to day. And one thing that we kind of landed on was this idea that I'm absolutely guilty of as a parent, which is that clinical trial participation isn't always fun for these kids. I would argue that it's very rarely fun. And so as a parent, you try and make it as good as an experience as you can. And so you tell them, okay, we're going to get a hotel with a pool and we're going to go to the zoo. And so a lot of times the kids will end up getting pushed far beyond the way that they self-regulate at home, which means that they can be fatigued, particularly in their second day of assessment in the clinic. So this is a list of studies that have not ended up moving forward, either in Duchenne, that have been conducted over the last decade or so. And I bring this list up absolutely not to discourage clinical trial participation, because I 100% believe that we are in a new era of drug development in Duchenne, and we're in a new era of clinical trial participation in Duchenne. But I do bring it up because I think anytime a group has undertaken a significant sacrifice to pave the path for people that come after them, that it's important to acknowledge that sacrifice and to do the best that we can to learn from it. And each one of these studies, represents a group of families that have given up, employment opportunities, time with siblings, normalized childhood, literal flesh and blood to participate in these studies. It's a really an extraordinary sacrifice. And so what we're trying to develop is really an effort to learn as much as we can from the experiences of these families and to come up with a way to provide more definitive data, so that we don't end up in the situation that some of the participants in these studies have ended up, which is with the question of not knowing if it was the treatment or the outcome measures or the study design that was the particular issue. And that's the most difficult position to be in, because then it really takes this contribution of time that all of these families have made and makes that more meaningless. So I guess just to start on a personal note, I am one of those families. My family spent almost 2 years flying every Wednesday from Seattle to Vancouver, Canada, to participate in a study. And that study ended up being halted due to lack of definitive evidence on the endpoint. So it failed its primary endpoint, but it was accompanied by a really passionate group of families that felt that they were seeing something, and that's such a difficult position to be in, because you just don't know either way. And so when my son started his third clinical trial, we made the decision as a family to come up with our own way of tracking his progression, because we really wanted some definitive evidence of how he was doing. And the question we were really trying to solve is not how much treatment benefit is, worth a certain amount of, reimbursement. We were really just focused on a very simple question, which is the trajectory that we were seeing from him, is his progression looking different than it would have looked otherwise? And so we looked at the things that he struggled with the most or had recently lost the ability to do. And getting into the minivan was a really meaningful one to him, because it was really embarrassing for him to be lifted into the minivan by his mom in front of the middle school. And this is what he looked like at the beginning of the study. And this is what he looked like 5 months into the study. And then this is what he looked like 7 months. And so when we saw these videos, we really thought, okay, there's something here about the ease of his movement, the quality of his movement, that is reflective of the fact that this particular task is getting easier for him, and then that was a meaningful task. And so that's when we landed on this idea that maybe we could quantify this in a really standardized and rigorous way. So that's what led us down this path. So one of the studies that was on a previous slide there was for an antifibrotic that was halted because of an adverse event. And these, quite frankly, I will say, if any of them are on the call, are some of the bravest, most courageous parents that I've interacted with, because they were faced with, a really traumatic situation. I mean, we all still grieve, for this family that was affected by this adverse event. And yet at the same time, they were in this study that was halted. There was some promising preliminary data, and their kids were withdrawn from drug. But in the midst of all of that, and all of those really complicated emotions, they agreed to put their children on video as they were withdrawn from treatment. For us, it was a really fantastic learning experience, and so we're extremely grateful to those families. And so one of the things they did was film children in a standardized position over the course of drug withdrawal. And then we also had them film a caregiver choice. And so I just want to contrast the two because I think it's a really good way to explain why it's so difficult to figure out what we're going to measure in Duchenne. So this is what this child looked like at time point 1, so directly after drug withdrawal, standing up from the floor, so a standardized cross-legged position. So that's time point 1. And this is time point 3. So this is 6 months later. And if you time the video out, he times out very similarly, looks pretty similar in terms of his strategy of getting off the floor. So if you came away from these 2 assessments just by looking at this as a standardized outcome across the entire population of kids in the study, you would come away with the conclusion that he's stable over this duration of time. But the parents knew that by asking him to cross his arms while performing the same task, that would stress his current abilities, that you would see what was actually going on with his progression over this time period. So this is time point 1. And this is time point 2. So this is 3 months later. So it's an interim video between the 2 previous. And you can see how much more difficult it is for him to raise that second leg. And by time point 3, he can't accomplish this task anymore. So this ended up being really eye-opening for me, because it was just such a good demonstration that you can look at a standardized outcome measure and come away with the wrong conclusion about where a patient's at in his progression. And it's only by drilling down into a really patient-specific way that you can see what's actually going on over that period of time. And it makes it even more challenging the shorter duration of time that you're looking at. So with that background in mind, that's where we came away with the goals for what we wanted to accomplish in developing these outcome measures. And number 1 is what I just spoke to, which is that we wanted to really meet each patient where he's at the time he enters the study, and be able to quantify the trajectory of each individual patient. We wanted to make sure we were looking at ease of movement rather than speed of movement by counting these, what we call compensatory movement patterns. So that all the things that you do without really being aware that you're doing it to work around progressive weakness. It's like if you sprain your ankle when you're running and sometimes you're not really aware that you're limping. It's kind of similar to that idea. We wanted to make sure that we captured all the nuanced compensations that would allow us to detect change over a short period of time. But then on the flip side, only quantify compensations that were clinically meaningful. So ones that were significant enough that it reflected a clinically meaningful amount of progression. We wanted to allow for different compensatory strategies from boy to boy. So when we started looking at videos of boys getting off the floor, some of them will walk their hands along the floor, but they won't push their hands off their thighs. And some of them will push their hands off their thighs, but they won't walk their hands along the floor. And so we didn't want to be forced to put that into a spectrum that might just be by chance. We wanted to just make it a more streamlined way of quantifying what we were seeing. And then lastly, we wanted to provide a window into how the kids were functioning in their home environment, because that's what we really care about, is how are they living their lives? How are they navigating, the home where they live? Because that's, what's really important to all of our daily lives.
So a lot of people are asking, why does it matter if you move more easily or if you look like you move more easily? And it's important because we know that that is a progression of your abilities. So more than just the way you look, it's a time path. It's a roadmap to when you're going to either gain or lose abilities. So Mindy mentioned the fact that when you have pain, you limp. You don't choose to limp. You don't choose to walk, spend less time on that ankle. Your body maximizes its ability, so it shifts weight off of that. The little stick figures show alignment. And so when you fall, your knees, hips, and ankles all collapse. So boys with Duchenne change their posture so that when they need less muscle mass and less strength to keep them upright. And it's consistent. It's a consistent changes because of the way your body, your alignment, and where your muscles, how your muscles work. And so we can tell by looking at these boys where in the progression they are, and we can guess when they're going to lose their next ability. Let me show the next one. So this is a picture, a video of a boy eating. And so the goal for anyone who's eating is you want to get your hand to your mouth. So healthy people without muscle weakness would just bend their elbow and bring their hand up to their mouth. When you don't have sufficient muscle strength in your biceps, the goal is still the same. You want to get your hand to your mouth. So if you watch this boy, he uses his elbow, but he also shrugs his shoulder up because that also gets your hands to your mouth. Nobody teaches him or cues him how to do this. It's just the body can figure out a way to move. And so these are the things that we can watch and say, that is more difficult for him. You also notice how he leans to the side again when he gets up there to get his hand to his mouth. So there's a very consistent set of compensations that the boys use just based on, we know the goal is to get your hands to your mouth, and these are the muscles that can help. So by that, we think we can quantify how many of these we see and how severe these compensations are to tell whether they're getting better or worse.
So I'll just give a little kind of primer about how the whole thing works. So we have a list of daily tasks that we've selected just by talking to different physical therapists and talking to different parents about, what aspects of their life are important. So somebody who's developing a treatment could select from that menu based on the particular young men or boys that are in their study. And then parents can watch training videos that have standardized the capture procedures. So we've got little training videos that tell you, you stand here, he stands here. We give you a little supply kit where you can put painter's tape on the ground to mark where you stand and where he stands and what you say and whether he wears shoes, and all those pieces are standardized and captured in the training videos. And then parents can record their kids performing those tasks at home. And you can use a mobile app that you can download from Google Play or the App Store, and it's secure and protects your privacy. And then once those videos come in, we have a group of people that do quality control checks on them to make sure that they've been captured properly. And then we send any back for a reshoot that might need a reshoot done. And then we have a group of physical therapists that have trained as what we call central raters to do all the scoring. And they can do that all remotely through a dashboard. And then we just look at the change over time for individual patients. And then a lot of times we also do ask that caregivers do this caregiver choice because we all know as parents that there's really kind of one thing at one period of time that you're looking at when you really want to face what's happening with your son. And it's kind of the thing that I tend to look away from when I don't really want to face up to what's going on at that particular time. My theory is that's the thing that changes the fastest. It's the one thing you've got your eye on. And so we've asked caregivers a lot of times to put those on video as well as a caregiver choice. And then sometimes you can't always predict how treatment benefit might potentially show up in a clinical trial. So if a child gains a new ability, we have caregivers put those on video as well, because those can help us maybe develop future scorecards as we move forward. So this is the list of tasks that we have. Obviously there are tasks that are geared more towards a younger boy who's in a study, and then there are tasks that are geared more towards young men that are further along in their progression. Each one is been informed by people in the Duchenne community. Like, for example, it's really important that in the reach across the table to grab the cell phone, that it was screened down because none of the young men wanted people reading their texts or whatever. And so you want to store your phone, screen down so nobody's in your business. So you need to be able to, reach it and flip it. And then, some are really, important in an obvious way to those of us in the community, but some people might not understand why getting an arm back on an armrest is so important. Obviously it allows you to steer a power chair, but it also gives you the ability to get that arm higher using the armrest as leverage. So the list of tasks really spans the entire progression of Duchenne. And each one of them is linked to a certain degree of loss of independence. So there's something significant that happens to the young men and their families when each one of these activities is lost. Okay, so I'll go into some examples of how this works. So this is the same young man from that previous study. This is going up the stairs. So this is at time point 1. And this is time point 2. So interestingly, if you time these out, they actually time out very similarly. But I think, even not being trained physical therapists, those of you on the phone who may not be trained physical therapists can tell that it's getting a little harder at that second time period. So with our quantification method, that's something that we can actually score. So we look at the step pattern. So all of the healthy kids that we've taken a look at, their knees stay perfectly straight when they go up the stairs. And even the really, really strong kids with Duchenne that can motor up an entire flight of stairs, you can see their kneecaps kind of go in or out. So they're accessing different muscles besides their quads to get them to clear the riser. And then they progress to what we call a step 2 pattern, which is leading with the same leg. So you can see in the first video, he's leading with the same leg on that first stair, and then he's able to alternate for the remainder of the stairs. But by the second time point, he's using a consistent step 2 pattern. Well, that's a significant change. And then he's also gone from using one arm on the handrail to using 2 arms on the handrail. It's really straightforward. And he hasn't quite progressed to the point where this D criteria comes into play. But all the healthy kids will keep their legs, kind of directly underneath them. The boys with Duchenne, when they start to experience a little more trouble on the stairs, you'll see a wide base of support. So you see their upper body kind of rock back and forth because their feet are further apart. And then they'll actually collapse that in and turn to face the wall or the railing and sidestep up the stairs. And then when that gets a little bit more difficult, kind of the last thing we see before they stop going upstairs is this leaning over the railing to kind of take some of the weight bearing off their legs. So this is something that's really easily observable. We can all see based on those previous videos what that young man was doing, but here we can quantify it. And so he's got 3 out of 9 compensations at one time point to 5 out of 9 for a change of 23% over this particular time period. And this is a change that occurred over a 6-month period of time. This one's actually mine, and I'm using this one just because it shows change in the opposite direction. So there was only a 1-month difference between these 2 videos. These were taken before we standardized the capture procedures, so I do a really horrible job of, I think, cutting off his head at one point, but you can still see the movement patterns that we're talking about. So this is 3 months on Exandes, and this is him getting off the floor from a supine position. So you can see he's walking his hands along the floor, he's pushing off of both thighs, and then he kind of has to circle his torso around to get it to lift up. But then 1 month later, you can see that it's just gotten a little bit easier for him, but we can actually quantify that. So instead of pushing both hands off of his thighs, he's just pushing one. And instead of having to kind of strain to get that torso lifted, he just pops his torso right up. So he's shed 2 compensations. So he's got a change in severity percentage from 91% to 73%. And our theory is that the higher your severity percentage, the closer you are to losing that particular ability. So when you're at a 91 and you shed down to a 73, it's our hypothesis that that's a meaningful amount of change. So I'll turn it over to Christine, and she's going to talk a little bit about this experience.
Yeah, so this is we know there's a lack of outcome measures, and certainly seem to be a lack of trials in non-ambulatory boys. And so this was an interesting experiment for me to be able to do when I learned that there was a young man just starting drug. And we kind of talked through what types of activities would be important to him. And one of the things that he mentioned was he was having difficulty sitting up in bed. Mom was getting ready for work each day, and it was hard on him to keep calling mom to help him sit back up in bed. And again, this was before we standardized anything. So we do have a task that's similar to this now in our toolbox, but we standardized it we ship everybody the same bed wedge to be able to sit up in bed with. And so this was, again, an experiment, but a great retrospective look in how this young man changed. So this is time point 1.
Sorry, Christine.
That's okay.
That's time point 2. Just a second. There you go.
So he's asked to sit straight up in bed, to stay there, move forward about 6 inches, move back to the center point, and then move side to side. So as you can see, as he came up there, he kind of fell forward, and then he kind of just circled himself around to move from side to side. And then 9 weeks later, mom was able to go in, and again, this isn't standardized, so the position does look a little bit different, but I think your response would be the same, is that it's significantly different. He's able to sit up straight. You can see the difference in his neck and his chin. He's able to move forward, get back, and then his way he moves from side to side is different. His torso appears to be much stronger than it was in the initial video. So that was 9 weeks. And then he's going to show off here, puts his cell phone to his ear because he doesn't want anyone to hear his phone calls. So again, this is a piece of independence that this young man was able to get back. And that's so important to this population, is whatever we can give back to them is so meaningful to their everyday lives.
So like Christine said, these are really the factors that those of us who've watched boys and young men progress through Duchenne, it's the things that we kind of notice, these little compensations. And it's the things that our physical therapists have been noticing and talking to us about over time as well. So it was really just taking those items and figuring out a way, that we could standardize them so that we could present them to regulators in a way that that would be compelling. So I want to just talk a little bit about qualification. So we're now in the qualification pathway at FDA, and we're submitting for qualification to the European Medicines Agency. So just want to talk a little bit about why that's important. And so while it may seem really straightforward to all of us as parents that, you can really viscerally see on these videos that it's getting easier or it's getting harder for these kids to go about their daily lives. But we do also really need to prove to these regulatory groups that we're measuring what we say we're measuring, that in counting these compensations, that's really reflective of progression in Duchenne. And we also need to prove to them that what we're measuring are changes that are meaningful to patients and their families. And so how we really feel is that these changes are meaningful in an immediate way, because it's always better to have a kid be able to go about his daily life with more ease rather than more difficulty. But we also see them as a sign that they're not progressing as quickly to losing that particular ability, which is incredibly meaningful to these boys. So in terms of qualification and being able to prove these two things to regulators, and the nice thing about going through this process is that it's basically kind of getting agreement from these agencies that they're interpreting the data in the same way that we are. There's a couple of different pieces that we need to take on. And the first is the work that needed to be done before anybody captured videos in the study, which is, are we picking the right things to put on video? Are we picking the right tasks? Have we standardized the way that they're captured to the best of our ability? And then are people able to use the mobile app easily enough? So we made sure that we tackled those pieces several years ago. And then we really moved on to the second piece. Once everybody started capturing these videos in studies, then we moved on to the second piece, which is, how are we going to score them? And how are we going to quantify the changes that we're seeing in a really reliable way? So this is really the process that we went through to figure out that scoring. So the first thing we did was take advantage of Linda's amazing team at Nationwide. And so we sat with that group in 2 different sessions, and we watched a lot of videos, and people came up with their own compensation lists, and then we discussed them and built them kind of into a consensus list. So at that point, we then put them into scorecards. We wanted to make sure that if a particular compensation was replaced by something that might be more severe, that didn't end up looking like improvement in the way that it was scored. And then a year ago, we did a 10-hour discussion with some amazing physical therapists who see, if I probably name names, probably a lot of you on the list have had kids evaluated by these folks, because they do a lot of clinical trial evaluations, and they were really generous in lending their expertise to this process. And the nice thing about that is, it's kind of an N of 1 situation with all of us in our families. We see our boys progress in particular ways, but the important piece about involving these physical therapists is that they've seen, all of our boys. And so they were able to take that really broad experience with large numbers of boys and take a look at the way that we'd done the scorecards. So we basically sent out the scorecards in advance without any training or any explanation or anything. We wanted to make it as hard on them as possible. And then we asked them to score 4 videos. So a healthy child, and then 3 patients with Duchenne that represented a spectrum of strength in that particular task. And then we had them comment on whether any of the compensations weren't clinically meaningful. And anytime we didn't have 100% agreement amongst those PTs, we put it on our discussion list. So it was a really long, really detailed discussion, and we came away from it with some agreement on how to put the scorecards together. So then the next thing we needed to do was to test whether they're working properly. So that's when we started conducting some of those analyses. Really what enabled us to do those analyses was cooperation from all of you guys in the community. So we launched what we called our source material study, and we had 70 families participate, and people were extraordinarily helpful in doing this. It's not easy, to watch progression closely. and people were very generous, both parents and their boys. And so we're incredibly grateful to everybody that participated in this study. We had a large number of families in all different age groups. People volunteered their healthy neighbors to be in our healthy cohort or their healthy siblings. So we had, patients with DMD and patients without DMD, and all of that material is what enabled us to do all of the analyses that we needed to do to be able to start to put together this package for FDA. So I'll talk a little bit about the analyses that we did. We wanted to take a look at who were going to be the people that are scoring these videos. So we wanted to be able to know for sure, based on evidence, do we need these PTs to be people who have specialty expertise in patients with Duchenne, or could they just be physical therapists that don't necessarily see Duchenne patients but know a lot about analyzing movement? So we had half of them who participated in our scoring be expertise with Duchenne, and then half of them were physical therapists that hadn't seen a lot of Duchenne patients. And then we did 2 types of testing. So the first one it's called inter-rater, and it's basically, if you have a whole bunch of physical therapists, are they scoring these videos the same way from one another? So how much variation do you see from therapist to therapist in the way the videos are scored? So we had 15 PTs, and they scored the same 5 videos for each of the 17 movement tasks. And then you also want to know, if you have one physical therapist score it, and they came back and did it at a later time point, do those match? Or do they change over time just because you haven't nailed it closely enough? So we had 9 of those PTs come back and score the same videos 4 weeks later. So I'm just putting this up here for reference. I don't expect anybody to kind of go through this data, but the closer you are to 1.0, the more agreement you have between the PTs. So this data just addresses how much agreement we had from physical therapist to physical therapist. So the closer you are to 1.0, the better the agreement. If 1.0 is perfect agreement. So we were really excited at how high these numbers came out, which to us proved that it was really a reliable way to quantify these compensations that we were seeing in the boys. And then similarly, this is inter-rater. So this is how much agreement is there in the same physical therapist between the way they scored it at one time point and the way that they scored it 4 weeks later. Did those match, or were they different? And so the closer it is to 1.0, the more those 2 time points agreed with one another. So we were equally excited to see how high these results came out. The other thing we did is took a look at something called construct validity, which is basically, are we measuring what we say we're measuring, which is muscle decline in Duchenne. So we had Dr. Sue Apcon, who we're extraordinarily grateful to, take a look at each video. And what she did was put each video into 5 different groups. So does this patient show no weakness, mild weakness, moderate weakness, severe weakness, or is he unable to complete the task? And then what we did is take a look at whether the severity percentages from our scorecards kind of mapped to the buckets that she put everybody into. And what we saw is that the weaker the groups got, the higher the severity percentages on our scorecards went. And so what that told us is that, her expert opinion of how these patients were progressing, the level of weakness that she saw mapped to the scores that we saw in our scorecard quantification. So once we completed these 3 analyses, we were excited about the level of, validity that we demonstrated. We really felt like, okay, we have something here. This isn't just a theory anymore. This is an actual viable way to take a look at how these boys are progressing. So the last piece I want to address is the part that's kind of closest to my heart, which is, when families sign up to participate in a clinical trial, it's a really huge commitment, and there's a lot that's asked of you. And so if there are ways that we can reduce that burden for families, that's a service for everyone. It's a service for these boys who are, a lot of times participating at a time when their lives wouldn't really be medicalized to that extent. So the more that we can keep their lives as normal as possible, the better. On the flip side, though, there's always this idea of we want to make sure that we're not putting too heavy a burden on families to participate. So we really wanted to take a really close look at how people felt about participating in these video captures. Was it really emotionally difficult for caregivers to film? Because in essence, we're asking people to be partners in a clinical study when they're capturing data at home themselves. So we had people in the source material study fill out a questionnaire where we asked them to rate kind of the emotional difficulty for both the caregiver and the patient of completing the video assessments at home, and then how emotionally difficult was it for people to complete the assessments in the clinic. And they used a 5-point scale. And then they just talked about their preferences in terms of traveling or doing assessments at home. And the results were really interesting. So the caregivers reported, let me get here. Most patients, 79% of patients reported that they preferred home-based video assessments to traveling to a clinical site. The majority of the caregivers preferred that. The caregivers that talked about preferring to travel to clinical sites were saying things like they tended to be parents of younger children, and they talked about how it was really nice to receive feedback from the assessors about how their kids were doing. So we think that that was really reflective of kind of a clinical visit rather than a trial assessment, because obviously people know that when your child's participating in a clinical trial, the therapist can't tell you anything about how your child's doing. But we thought that was a really interesting piece. And for me, it was a huge realization. And I'm gonna talk a little bit about why. I don't know if people have seen this. It has circulated a little bit. It was from an article in the LA Times, and it circulated a little bit a couple of years ago amongst the community. And it talks about this idea of grief. And it's like a little rule book for how to handle grief. And basically, it talks about how the person that the event is happening to is in the middle of the circle. And then everybody that's close to that person is the next circle out. And then as you get further and further out, people are a little bit more removed from that person in the middle of the circle. And the rule is that the only thing that goes in is providing comfort to the people that are one circle in. And if you need to vent your emotions, that has to go out. And when I saw these results about how, a little more than half of the caregivers preferred home-based assessment than clinic assessment, but the vast majority of patients preferred home-based assessment, what it made me think about is this mistake that I think I've made as a parent from the very beginning, which is that, you have this baby and there's this difficulty sometimes in separating you from them when they're little, and then they grow up and you realize that they're separate from you. And in Duchenne, what I realized from looking at this is the mistake that I had made as a parent is that I put myself in the middle of the circle. I thought, this is happening to me. I'm the person that this is happening to. And it was a huge realization that, Aiden, my son, is in the middle of the circle and I'm the next ring out. Even said as parent. I think I would have realized it sooner. And so it was a huge realization to me that in my clinical trial journey, there were probably times that I dumped my frustration about things that were happening to us on him in a way that probably wasn't the best. And so what it enabled me to realize when I looked at this data was that as a parent, when you go in to be assessed in a clinical trial, the child's taken away from you into another room, and you don't have to watch what happens. And that might make it easier for you, but he's still going through it. And so these two pieces together just made me realize that what's really important is what's easier for these boys and these young men, because they're the ones that are being asked to go through it. And after all, we are, not in the middle of the circle with them. We are one ring out. That's not to say that's not extraordinarily difficult, but it was a great reminder for me. I will say, however, that in taking these videos in a variety of different situations, it can be extraordinarily difficult to watch progression in such a close manner at home. Conversely, if you're in a situation where you're in a clinical trial where you're seeing improvement or you're even seeing stability, it can be a really joyous experience to watch that closely. It can be exciting and gratifying and thrilling. And so, it's just another reminder that, this is all happening to him, whether we have a camera on it or not. So that was just always, I think, a good reminder for me. So I just want to end by thanking some groups that we absolutely need to give thanks to. So that source material study that I mentioned, it was a extensive effort, and it was funded by Charlie's Fund, which has had kind of faith and confidence in this idea from the very beginning, and we're eternally grateful to them. We would be nowhere without the help of the team from Nationwide Children's, with Linda and her team, and for people at Parent Project who helped us recruit that source material study and who have been supportive from the very beginning. We've been lucky enough to get a grant from the FDA to work with the amazing team at the Critical Path Institute, who've provided really necessary guidance, and have not called us cute moms once, but have been really great to work with. And then the great team at Optum who helped us with our original round of validation in the capture procedures. So just extensive thanks to all of them. And then lastly, just a great deal of thanks to all of you who may be online, whose kids may have participated in our source material study, who are potentially capturing some of these videos as you're participating in an interventional study. We're grateful to you as well. I know it's extra effort, but I really feel like if you didn't see change in these compensatory movement patterns, that's a way to get a definitive answer on whether something is helping or not. So anything that anybody else wants to add or before we move over to some questions?
Mindy, that was very timely. It's exactly 2:45.
It was an accident.
All of you. It was really a wonderful presentation, and it is so innovative and so terrific and so good, because I think parents are the experts, and whether we video something or not, we certainly see change, positive or negative, and we celebrate that or mourn that as well. So we have a number of questions that have come in, and I'm just going to go through them as they've come in, just so, first of all, everyone that has commented said, great job, can we bring this everywhere? And I think you all and I are in favor of doing that to reduce the burden and really be inclusive in trials. So for the first question is, improvement is a bit easier to see if you're lucky enough to see an improvement. Mm-hmm. They are experience of, but what is the experience of slowing progression? It's much harder to know if it's any better when you don't know how he would be progressing without therapy. How do you measure this? That's a little bit confusing, but I think, what's the effect of physical therapy? How do you measure this if it's very slow progression? What's the natural, how does it change the natural history?
Yeah, 100%. So it's a really, really important question. And as we start collecting more data and studies, we'll know more. And it gets really, really nuanced. I think a lot of us as parents have seen how you can see a little bump in function, even from something where you're increasing your child's steroid dose to keep up with, weight gain over the years. You can kind of see a little spike in function over a short period of time. So I think it's important to take all of those little pieces into account and make sure that you're kind of separating out data capture from those potential confounds, I guess, of other things that can affect it. And so it is a really good point. It's really difficult to know if the trajectory is different than it would have been otherwise. Having said that, and we'll be able to take a look at this. We're scoring the 2 time points from our source material study. So we'll be able to look empirically, be able to look at the data to see whether this happens. I, as a parent, have not seen a kid shed a compensation without an intervention once it's been acquired. So it's our kind of assertion that if a child is past a certain age, where it might be just a maturational thing, where he's changing the way he's moving because he's getting older and more mature, and we're going to take a look at what is that age that's established, because we have 4 to 6 year olds in our source material study, and we have healthy 4 to 6 year olds. So we'll be to see which compensations might be showing up in some of those healthy kids. But after a certain time point, when they acquire a compensation due to weakness, we'll be able to take a look at, is that actually ever shed, without a potential intervention? So once we're able to take a look at that second time point in our source material study, we'll be able to see, is that actually happening? As a parent, I've never seen it. They add these compensations because they have to. And I have yet to see one go away in my son, unless he's, had a potential intervention start, or, unless he's had a change in steroid dose or something like that.
Yeah, I think, I completely agree with you. I'm sure Christine would say the same, because I have not seen a child shed the accommodation he makes unless there's an intervention. And
this is the big question.
Sorry, the big one.
The big question for any outcome measure is, how do we know if we're slowing the rate of progression because of the different mutations and the different modifiers? So I think this is the question for everyone. If they're getting better, that's quite easy. If we think we're slowing them down, that takes time to figure out. We need natural history data. So that's why starting this project is so important, and getting people the people that have volunteered to be in it, because we need to quantify this. We need to look at the rate of acquiring compensations in different types of boys with this disease.
Which kind of on to the question about, and all of you should comment on this. I was wondering if there have been any comparisons done between the assessments at home around the same time point in the clinical setting. So how does the clinic compare with the home? And do you have any data on that?
Christine, I don't know if you want to take this, but we've got data sets that are outstanding in which we'll be able to take a look at that. So they're in the process of being scored.
We should know something shortly.
Yeah.
Okay. That's good. So another question is about video assessments being used to support a denial. Have you done that? Have you used video assessments in denials? And if so, what's been the most successful way to support an appeal or peer-to-peer process where healthcare providers, team member would be needed and need to be involved?
And we're talking about a payer denial, not a regulatory denial, correct?
No.
Okay, so I have a very personal story on that front. The tough part is that, and I know there are people that are far greater experts than me who are probably on this webinar, we should probably turn it over to them. So I can only tell kind of my personal story, which is, when Exondys was given accelerated approval, with the idea that we would, get some, really definitive data in the years to come, there was quite a bit of reluctance on the part of some payers to cover. And so my insurance company issued a denial, and it was a really strict denial. They were requiring muscle biopsies for ongoing coverage. So they wanted kids to have a muscle biopsy at baseline and then a muscle biopsy at 6 months to justify ongoing coverage. So we were able to get these videos over to, the decision makers at my particular insurance company, and the denial was overturned within 48 hours without my having to file an appeal. Having said that, I also know that my payer worked very closely with KOL. So that payer was also, doing some really active research on that front as well. So that was also very helpful. But that was my personal experience. I think the issue is, what is the pathway to be able to get this evidence over to a payer? And can we forge that pathway so that it becomes a matter of practice? Because it does really have that visceral impact. It's very hard to look at those videos of Aiden getting in the minivan and say that nothing's happening there. And I think for payers, it also enables them to really get an understanding of how daily life works for these patients and the ways in which it can be changed.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I mean, you see the videos of Aiden getting in the car, and it is a guttural. You see it. You can feel it. You feel, and you also, to some degree, see him in terms of how his emotional response is getting into the car, right? So to create a pathway for payers would be really useful. Christine, did you have denials on JET?
I did not have denials on JET, but I have had 2 other patients who I don't want to name in different states have Medicaid denials that were overturned by getting baseline videos and then 9 to 12 week videos. They were overturned using the videos.
So it is a way. I mean, it is certainly being used in this context.
Yep.
And Linda, as a KOL, are you intervening with these or having experience with these payers as well? I think as a parent who have had children with Duchenne, when you get a payer, one of those letters in the mail that says not authorized, not required, and you're kind of saying to yourself, I need this person to live with me for maybe 48 hours, and then we'd all have a different opinion. So tell me how you deal with this.
We spend a whole lot of time writing letters and citing different ways that even maintaining is going to make their life a lot easier, and they're going to have fewer repercussions because we know different things happen when you're not exercising, you're not walking. And so the videos would be a much more succinct way to show those things, because we spend a whole lot of time writing.
Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, it's true. We certainly need, we could spend the next couple of days talking about the healthcare system in the United States, but I think that's not the purpose here.
Yeah,
but,
and I'm sorry to interrupt. This is Ryan. I heard payers come up. So this is certainly something that we're dealing with at PPMD on a daily basis in terms of working with families on appeals and the whole process. I mean, in truth, many of these payers are looking to the trial data and what outcomes were measured within the trial. I think there's a hope that if we get to a place where a measure like this is utilized in that trial, there will be way more willingness across the country to utilize it within the payer space. But some of this comes down so much to the direct interaction with the payer. Sometimes it takes getting to the end of the appeals process, an external review. But point being that there are points in the appeals process that you could submit these type of videos, as Mindy and others have explained. I think we have work to do, and I'm encouraged by things like this because I think there's going to be a better path for payers down the road if we can get there. Sorry, I just wanted to interject that.
Well, thank you, Brian, for that. And we have another mom who's commented that she had a denial overturned with the help of a video, in addition to a firm letter and some help from a KOL. But I'm going to go back to Casimir as outcome measures. I think that in the midst of this pandemic, we certainly are not going to be able to do trials the way they have been being done. So I think that this approach is incredibly opportunistic for our community and for our families and for all of the young men who need and deserve to participate in studies. It is hard for me to look at these studies that are focused on a certain population of ambulatory or these very narrow populations. Not that we don't want to focus there, but it seems to me that all these young men should have the opportunity, if they wish to participate. All of their families can be and are experts in this disease progression. And often one of the comments here online is the hypothesis is that kids may perform better in front of a therapist than they will at home, perhaps. And I don't know, Linda, if you want to comment on that. I would guess it has all of these elements. And did they travel? Are they in a good mood? Did they have sugar for breakfast? Did they not have what they want? Are they wearing the shoes they like or they don't like? Do they like you? Or do they like somebody else a little bit better? I mean, I think there's so many factors on whether or not they are willing to perform. And I think at the end, the little sort of circle that Mindy showed, they are the center. And sometimes they just want to please all of us instead of really thinking about themselves first, which is, I think, as we as parents have to put them and their vision first and think about them first, even in our anxiety of wanting to do the best for them and to find therapies for them. I think this is an incredible step forward. It feels like amazing progress for our community and for everyone in it. I'd love to do a natural history study. I'd love this whole community to get behind a natural history study. Or, wouldn't it be amazing? And of course, being a dreamer, I think that if we all had this ability to capture our sons along the way, then we might have a much better natural history study and then maybe be able to more rigorously understand what benefits they're receiving from standard of care, from steroids, from supplements, from exon 51, 53, whatever is approved, gene therapies, and hopefully in this world we'd see far different outcomes. So just last comments, Christine, and then Mindy, and then Linda, and then we'd love to do this again and soon, and love to think about natural history studies. So Christine, parting comments as we have 3 minutes left.
Yeah, I really want to think about how we actually normalize our lives and we make clinical trials, how do we make clinical trials as part of our lives versus how do we fit our lives into a clinical trial? Because that's really difficult, right? And so I've traveled all over the country with Jet when he was younger, and I'm not going to say that I regret participating in clinical trials, but we missed a lot. Like I remember December of 2012, I think it was, I spent 3 weeks before Christmas in Columbus, Ohio. And my kids were all in school at that time. I mean, so there's so much sacrifice that has gone into clinical trials, and I want to learn from it. I want to glean from it. And I really just want to make it something like this more of a reality. And what we didn't touch on, I think we need to, is that we have a lot of quality and compliance in what we do as well. And so just know that where videos are stored, they're stored in a safe place. We have quality people that look at them. There's data monitoring. There's all of the real serious stuff that goes on in the background is there, but we just didn't bring it all to you today.
Thank you. Keeping us secure is really important in this craziness we're living in. Mindy, last comments.
Yeah, I just to add on to what Christine had to say, if we can fundamentally change the level of difficulty that's required from families so that they can live a life, at the same time that they're participating in a clinical trial, that's my biggest passion and goal, because there have been times where, it's been really difficult for our family, and there's been a lot of sacrifice and some loss. And so if we can devise a system in which that's not required as much of our families, The other flip thing, that's the flip side of that is going to happen, is that we're going to open trial participation up to such a larger amount of families, people that might not necessarily have paid sick leave, that can take time off to get to clinic. You know, if they can take 20 minutes to take their videos in the afternoon rather than hopping on a plane and taking 2 days unpaid off of work, you know, that might put their employment in jeopardy. You know, that's a big deal. And so we're hopefully going to be, you know, an expansion of people who are able to participate in clinical trials just because of their life circumstances, other siblings, you know, all of those things. So that's an important piece too.
It is. We started a group in pediatric ethics and gene therapy with New York U, because we think that ethically all children in all families should have opportunities to participate, not just people who have employer support, money, whatever else it takes. So Linda, please comments.
The one comment that I always get asked is that, is this able to be, are you able to game the system by teaching your child how to move? And the answer is no. You limp when you have a sprained ankle because you can't walk the way you used to. So I think that's important to remember, is that this is not a choice. This is not a preferred way to move. This is a combination where your body can no longer do it in the typical way. And so this is your new normal. So I think that's an important point to make, that this is not a trainable skill to not use compensations.
Thank you for that, Linda. I think that parents are often criticized because you've trained them to do the 6-minute walk test, or you've trained them to do the 100-meter walk run in a certain period of time or go up the steps. But Duchenne causes muscle weakness, and Duchenne wins out, unfortunately, at this moment. So you can try, wish, pray, encourage, but at the end of the day, these children are dealing with compensations that they necessarily make based on muscle weakness. I have, in my career, worked with the Children's Oncology Group, and I admire them and dream about them all the time if we had a similar system, because children in pediatric leukemias, more specifically, go into a system, all of them, where they're given standard of care, and then they're in the best care and treatment possible, and then they're put in arms of studies where they could likely receive additional benefit. And I think if we could get a system where every child with Duchenne was diagnosed, put in the system, given video captures so that we can understand their natural history, their particular natural history, how they function at home, so that we could understand that and get them in these clinical trials and certainly get them access to approved therapies, then we've done a good job. So thank you all. You are amazing. I so appreciate what you do. I wish you were here. Well, I wish Chris and Patrick were here. I wish we could have done something. They didn't even have a single clinical trial to participate in. So the day is different, and our opportunities are great. Thank you for what you're doing, and to the degree that we can all help as a community, count us in. Thank you all for joining us today, and we'll hear more from the Casimir group. Thank you.